Yes, 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 I am. Okay. The little cards on the tables are placed there so that you can write down any questions that you have. And if you would do that and leave them on the table, then I will pick those cards up tonight and I will bring the answers back for all of us tonight. Was there a question already? No. Okay. Somebody asked me this past week, how long have you gone to this church? And the answer is that I still have the certificate that my mom and dad got when I was placed on the nursery roll at this church. And I have vague memories of being in the nursery here, and it was where the Sunshine class meets now, but I have very vague memories of that. And of course, I joined the church here when I was in the 3rd grade. You used to work up to the 3rd grade, and you always got a Bible at that time. And so it was not until I went to Emory and Henry College, which is a Methodist college, by the way, in southwestern Virginia. That was the first time that I had ever not come to church regularly with my parents, because we got up on Sunday morning and my 2 sisters and I were dressed in our pretty little clothes and off we all came to church. After I graduated from Emory and Henry, I got married, and I still took part in church activities, once at Damascus Methodist Church in Virginia, and then also at Abingdon Methodist Church in Virginia. And that's where I taught my first 7 years in Washington County, Virginia. And I still love thinking about it. Finally, in 1975, we moved here. I moved back here, and I've been here ever since, all of those years. Thank you. I do not know at what point in my life I got interested in church history, because I didn't teach history in school. I taught English and Spanish. But anyway, here I am, interested in history all of these years. So those are my credentials. That's the answer to the question about how I know so much about church history. There are also some discrepancies in dates that you may notice. That's making that sound again, isn't it? Yeah. No. 1835 or 1837, you may see and hear both dates. 1855 and 1857, you may hear and see both of those dates connected with our church. And as we go along, I'll point out the reasons why those discrepancies are there. The fact is that the deed for this lot was purchased in 1837, and we have documentation that members of the Methodist Episcopal Church were meeting in homes even before then. It is very possible that they were meeting as early as 1825, because Springfield had been formed in 1796, and so it's possible that we could have been meeting, which would mean that our church, no building necessarily, but people meeting together as Methodist, could have been meeting for 200 years now, which is it's a pretty fantastic thought. Now then, let me begin. I think that a few people thought that I was going to do a comedy routine, but I'm not. There are a few funny parts and there are a few shocking parts, but mostly it is the story of our church. And I've based my program around the 4 buildings that were here through the years. And there's a little set of pictures that Beanie Elam drew, and they're here and there in many homes, but I brought this one down from the archives so that you could take a look if you want to. Remember, this area used to be the wilderness. Think about it. Right here, no church, no houses, no street lights, not even any streets. wilderness. Methodism had come to the New World as early as 1766 when Philip Embury came from Ireland and began to preach, but in New York City. The first Methodist church in the colonies was built in 1768 or 1769. But we were still wilderness. Methodism came to Nashville in 1787 when the Cumberland District was created. It included Middle Tennessee and parts of Kentucky, sort of like it is today. Benjamin Ogden was appointed to the circuit, and it was one giant circuit because things weren't divided up into states. There were just a few very large states and the wilderness. And people like Ogden traveled from settlement to cabin to settlement where people needed them to marry people, to bury people, and there might have been months between the visits of the circuit riders. But the people waited in the wilderness, realized that savage attacks by Indians had occurred as late as 1794. And in the area close to where Mount Zion is now, not very far away. Remember that Battle Creek Baptist got its name because of an Indian massacre there. So that was one of the dangers that the circuit riders faced. The wilderness was also infested with wild animals. Even after Robertson County was established, county court records list the amount of money that will be paid as a bounty for wolf pelts. And yet, the circuit riders wandered out into this wilderness. Benjamin Ogden was supposedly only 23, but he was a veteran of the American Revolution. So Methodism was creeping toward us. Peter Cartwright was one of these men. He grew up near Adairsville and had been converted at one of the nearby camp meetings. Lorenzo Dow was another. Now, Jean and Norma and I remember Lorenzo Dow, who was a professor at Emory and Henry, but it's not the same Lorenzo Dow, okay? Well, you sort of need to understand that. I think it's interesting that Jean and Norma remembered the name. Now, you have to, without being rude, you have to think about the time that has elapsed since we saw Lorenzo Dow in college. But Jean and Norma remembered his wife's name. It was Alice. And I remember the way that Alice fixed her hair. So if you haven't learned it yet, memory is a really strange thing. Lorenzo Dow had a revival close to where we are this moment, and he called Tennessee a sink of iniquity, a black pit of irreligion. But here we are. The first Methodist church was established in the county in 1798, and of course that was Mount Zion. It was started at the home of Samuel Crockett and was part of the Red River Circuit. Springfield would become an appointment in this circuit and would remain one for 50 years. In 1798, however, the state of Tennessee was only 2 years old, as was Robertson County. It had been created along with Montgomery County when Tennessee, the state, was formed, and Tennessee, the county, was divided on April the 9th, 1796. So soon after that, the first session of the Robertson County Court was held in Jacob McCarty's home. It was decided that 50 acres of land centrally located was to be divided into lots and sold. The proceeds would be used to build a courthouse, a jail, and stocks. You know, stocks being how you were going to punish the troublemakers in this brand new community. On April the 20th, 1796, now April the 20th, which is 229 years ago, Easter Sunday, on April the 20th, 1796, an act was passed which would name the county seat of Robertson County Springfield. Now, Springfield was named first, and then the location was set. There never was a spring in a field. It was just named. Thomas Johnson and Archie Cheatham were the original owners of the 50 acres, a public square, 66 lots, and the street, and 10 streets were marked off. Each lot was sold for $8, and the purchasers did not know the location of the individual lots. You would pay your money, and then the location was drawn by lots. Yeah, who knew? Who knew? Lot 57 was purchased by Samuel Doris, and it was located at the intersection of 7th Avenue, which was Spring Street, with Oak Street. You know where that is? Sanctuary. Okay, way back in the 1830s. The lot was sold several times, but purchased by Dr. Archibald Thomas in 1834. Now, Thomas had come to Tennessee from Virginia in 1805. He served as a surgeon with Andrew Jackson in the Creek Wars and the War of 1812. He was there at the Battle of New Orleans. But then he came to Springfield after the war, and he was in practice with Dr. Hicks. I also have to tell you, one of my favorite, maybe saddest stories is that Archibald Thomas had a son who died at the Alamo. Our county archives have a document showing where Dr. Thomas was sending a representative to Texas to take care of the land that had belonged to Dr. Thomas's son. Meanwhile, back in Springfield, a number of families had already started meeting and worshiping as Methodist. Let me read you the names, because some you'll recognize either from where you're living or maybe families who are still here today. There were the Bradens, the Connells, Conrads, Englands, Harts, Henrys, Martins, Popes, Ryans, and Starks. And you may know some of those families are still around today. The heads of the families were the ones who got together to organize the Methodist Episcopal Church. There was no building at first. They met in homes. Dr. Thomas had bought Lot 57 in 1834. In 1837, for $50, his lot was deeded to the trustees of the Methodist Episcopal Church. The deed read, "In trust that they shall erect and build, or cause to be erected and built thereon, a house or place of worship for use of the members of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States of America." And that's us. That's how the building began, how we became situated in the first of our 4 buildings. And you can see that deed. It's recorded in Deed Book 3, page 144. And you can see the actual words, which is pretty amazing. So, a one-room log house of worship facing Spring Street, remember that's 7th Avenue now, was erected that year in 1837. And some of the members were Dr. Thomas, Joachim Green, Marshall Jameson, Mrs. John E. Garner, you know Garner Street, and the Dr. Hicks, the doctor, and his wife. The foundation had been laid, and the first of our Methodist churches was beginning. Now then, I don't want to skip that page. Out of the wilderness we had finally come. There is a surviving church register of early members and the pastors receiving them. The first name is Elizabeth Garner, who joined in 1833 before there was a building. There's a list of early pastors who served the church during 1837 to 1853 when it was part of the Red River Circuit. But because most of them were circuit men, they went to several different churches, and so there is just a list of the fact that they were here. Now, in 1845, the Louisville General Conference of the Methodist Church condemned slavery, 1845. This led to a split, and as you can see, if you stand at the blessing box and look up at the church, we became part of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It was not until 1939 that we became the Methodist Church. Of course, if you want to knock off the word South off of the top of the church, I'm sure you can do that if you want to get a ladder, put it on the steps with a chisel and hammer and hack it off. But when the church was built, when the sanctuary was built, we were still part of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Now then, we had headquarters. There were headquarters in Nashville and an independent publishing firm in Nashville. It's interesting to see before the split in 1840 that the Red River Circuit had 648 white members and 105 so-called colored members. That's the term that's actually used in the documents. When Springfield became a station, meaning an individual church that did not share a preacher, in 1853, we had 75 white members and 15 colored members. With the disagreement over slavery having caused such turmoil, I wonder about our African American church members. Were they slaves? Were they free? Were they household servants? I wonder, but I don't know. But the fact is that they were listed as church members, and that's important for us. S.D. Ogburn had been appointed to our church on October the 5th, 1884, and I'll mention him a lot later. He was followed in 1855 by Jeremiah Cullum. Lot 57 still housed our church. Now, Cullum took the time to keep journals, and so he left a record of the weather, important events, and life as a preacher. In his historical sketches published in 1907 by the Methodist Publishing House, he described the condition of the first church building as being dilapidated, old, and abandoned. Members were worshiping in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church just a couple of blocks away. Previous efforts to finance a new building had failed. Cullum wrote that this was largely due to two rival teams of builders that wanted the job. One group of church members who backed one team and wouldn't pledge unless their team got the job. The other group of members wouldn't pledge unless their team got the job. So Cullum said that he would be personally responsible for any lacking pledges so that a church could be built. He prayed about the situation, and then he began going through the town, house by house. Several citizens pledged $100, and remember, this was 1855. And Cullum had the old church, the 1837 church, torn down so that no one could back out of a pledge. This also allowed the new church to be built on the same lot. Apparently, all but $10 in pledges was collected. The new church was dedicated in 1855. Cullum wrote about preparations for the dedication, and he told that one lawyer, not a member of the church, told his daughter that he would give money to the church if she would wear calico to the dedication, in contrast to the other women's fine clothes. She wore calico, and he donated $50. Cullum was always pleased with the new church. John Hart supposedly said that Cullum did not date events from Anno Domini, but from the building of the 1855 Methodist Church. There are notes that refer to the church as being frame, but in Cullum's pastoral sketches, he clearly states that We built a beautiful brick church. Later, when the church burned, he mourned its loss. He said he had watched it being built brick by brick. Cullum learned a lot from his time in Springfield and counseled young pastors to do home visits. He told that in April 27, 1857, he had called on 41 families, which was half of the population of Springfield. He wrote that legs play a very important part in pastoral work. Cullum returned to Springfield, but not until after he served as a chaplain during the Civil War. This war, hard on everyone, did not leave Springfield untouched. After the fall of Fort Donelson, federal troops overran the entire area, taking whatever they needed and wanted. I asked you to think of the area's wilderness a while ago. Now think of it as it was when Fort Donelson fell. Try not to judge what happened by current feelings about those events in that period of time. Try to think of the town of Springfield as it was then. The Presbyterian Church was used as a stable by the horses of the Federal cavalry, and its floors still bear the hoof prints of those horses. A fort was built where the Robertson County Detention Facility and county offices are located. It was used by the occupying forces. Federal offices could be found in the old Cheatham Hotel, where the Colonial Hotel once stood, and where agricultural extension offices have stood. In addition, the building that was located where the Albion building stands on the square now was headquarters for Colonel Thomas Downey, who led the 15th United States Regiment of Colored Troops. Springfield was an occupied town, and for a couple of months in 1862, regular services were not held. While you may be dismayed, outraged by such an action, you must remember the conditions. Conference had not been held, and more than one preacher pastored the membership here. Reverend Ogburn preached here again. He would not have taken lightly the decision to call off church services. With federal troops throughout the town, church members were told that they must pray for the United States of America. And at that moment, the United States of America was the enemy. So church services were suspended for a brief time. Reverend Ogburn himself, I have to tell you, had 3 brothers-in-law fighting for the Confederacy. Colonel John B. Hutchison was killed near Woodbury, Tennessee, while riding with John Hunt Morgan. George B. Hutchison was wounded at Chancellorsville and died. Colonel W.R. Hutchison was wounded at Shiloh. He survived the war, however, and brought the bodies of his brothers home to be buried beside each other, and they are at Elmwood. Only in 1867 did Springfield Methodist Episcopal Church South become a station again. Preachers are listed from 1863 to 1867, but they served multiple churches. In 1864 to 1865, the church had 124 members. In 1878, there were 173. Couples married during those years included Charles C. Bell and Minerva Henry on November the 4th, 1858. That's your Henry and Bell connection. J.R. Brown and Josie Woodard were married on February the 7th, 1867. There's a Brown and Woodard connection for those of you who have been around for a while and to know those names. Jeremiah Cullum returned to Springfield in 1875. He found the office furnished with bed, chair, wardrobe, washstand, writing table, water vessels, combs, brushes, etc. Other things were not so good. The membership was 119, but it was membership divided. Again, apparently a split had come over church music, since some wanted the old organ gone and some felt it an improvement on the past. By December the 21st, the choir had subsided, Cullum's words. But all was not solved until January 29th, when the quarterly conference, the church council, sat, that is, without, they met solidly until it settled the difficulties. The resolution was, 1, to keep the organ, 2, to place it to the right of the pulpit, 3, to obliterate all choir lines, 4, to turn church music over to the pastor, and 5, to sustain the preacher prayerfully and firmly, which we still do, number 5. Upon his return, Cullum had stated that there were 7 saloons and 5 wholesale liquor houses in Springfield. Now, for those who laugh, the whiskey business was one of our 3 biggies: whiskey, tobacco, and eventually the woolen mills. Please understand, seriously, there is no way that so many people from Ireland and Scotland could have moved into this area without good whiskey being made. Many people were involved in the whiskey industry, and many people made money from it. I've been taunted with the supposed insult that whiskey money built your church. I'm not insulted. That's the truth. Jeremiah Cullum was not bothered either. He continued his practice of visiting around the town and wrote that he even visited the saloons, and he said, but on errands of mercy. Cullum's journal, Warm Hearts and Saddlebags, continues with the description of life in Springfield at the time. On Tuesday, March 16, 1876, for example, Cullum, John E. Garner, and Arch Thomas visited the jail. They were especially interested in a man named Mahaffey, who had been a prisoner for 4 years and who had read the Bible cover to cover 21 times. The Methodists left Mahaffey a new Bible. In May 1876, a storm damaged the church. On Saturday, June 3rd, Cullum wrote that the ladies of the church had a festival at the courthouse. He noted that this was the 3rd festival they had and that about $60 had been raised for repairs at the church. He added that they had met with some opposition, but that they had cheerfully continued and worked hard. And I really wish I knew what that opposition was all about. It sounds like another split was coming. Cullum recorded that the unsightly front of the church was torn out and remodeled and a spire put up 40 feet high. On July 12th, he wrote that the church had been vacated for repair work. It had been 2 weeks since services were held elsewhere, and Cullum said that it would be 2 more weeks before the congregation could get back in. August 13th, however, was the first Sunday that services could be held there. On Friday, September 8th, all repairs were finally complete. The painter had put the finishing touches on the spire. Cost of the work had been $250, and it had taken 13 weeks. I have to share with you what I found from a tattered old newspaper article that preserves the story of the wedding of Mr. J. Henry and Miss Lula Peck at the home of W.T. Peck in November 1876. The rites were performed by Brother Cullum. Attendants were Miss Lottie Garner and C.B. Stark, Miss Mary Peck, and Doc McIntosh. The ladies were attired in light silk dresses, and the bride wore a wreath of orange blossoms in her hair as well as her veil. Later, the bridal party and a few guests repaired to the dining room where an elegant repast was served. Don't you remember when newspapers used to tell good stuff like that? Yeah. What a loss, what a loss. Cullum continued to record information about Springfield, the uncommonly cold weather in January 1877, 16 below zero, writing to John Long's to buy a cow for $30, the fact that the rain was so hard on April 18th that the bell for services was not rung. Funerals were recorded in the journal, as were visiting preachers and a number of new members. Cullum included in his journals information about the forming of the Women's Society and about the camp meetings at Cedar Hill. He made a list in 1877 of the families in Springfield, not just Methodist, but all of the families, and it was published in Warm Hearts and Saddlebags. The list has been invaluable not just to Methodists, but to many local historians. And his journals, by the way, have been published, but they have also been revised. They were done in 2016. During the Civil War, as a chaplain, he had listed the injuries and deaths of the men in his company. After the battle at Shiloh, however, he and his journal became separated, and the journal was never seen again. Yeah, what a loss, what a loss. In 1877, however, Cullum was appointed to a new charge, and in 1882, only 5 years later, the 1855 church burned to the ground. So, a church built, a church torn down and rebuilt. We're going to look next week on the somewhat scandalous burning of that second church and the tearing down of a third church. On May the 7th, we're going to meet in the sanctuary so that we can look at the stained glass windows and talk about them. But tonight, we can only thank God for the men and women who believed then and who still believe now in sharing God's word and his love. We have a community, a church community that sings and prays and eats and laughs and learns together. Thank God for that. Well, thank you. You may go.